So how about recommendation letters? I know, like for sure, you want someone who is very enthusiastic about your journey. But apart from that, what other elements would you say are key for applicants to know when selecting their recommenders?
I think a lot of students assume that it has to be somebody from the school. It can be somebody that you've worked with. It can be your boss from your previous job, as long as that job is within public health. Like, we don't want a letter from your boss from TGI Fridays. That's not going to help you. But a boss at a nonprofit or a consulting firm that you worked at previously, that's an acceptable letter of recommendation. You also want it to be from somebody that you've actually worked with. There's a difference between that and I remember when I met this student 2 years
Yeah.
ago. They
Uh-huh.
picked up the material so easily. They're brilliant, and it's apparent that they'll do excellent in your program. That's different.
Yeah.
So you want to ask somebody who can adequately convey that you are a good candidate. I think also a lot of students just look for folks with big names, and
Yeah.
oftentimes those big names don't have time to write you a good recommendation letter. Now, even if that big name was, say, your actual advisor, but you spent most of your time working with their postdoctoral fellow, it would be a good idea to get a letter from that person, but you might want to draft it yourself. So if they don't have time to write you a recommendation letter, you can draft the letter for them. Just make sure that you don't send that same draft to multiple people. I've seen applications where I look through the letters and somebody sent that same draft and now they have two letters that say the exact same thing. But then on the other end of the spectrum, I've seen people who didn't draft a letter for a higher up that I knew. And so then their letter was 6 sentences. So you don't want that. If you draft a letter and if you send people drafts, send them different drafts. They're
Drafts. Uh-huh.
specific to how you know them. Now I always ask students for a draft when they ask me for a recommendation letter, just because sometimes I forget what they did. Like, I
Yeah.
got a request for a recommendation letter from a student who was my TA, and I asked her to draft it. And then in her letter, she told a story about how this is when COVID happened. My Zoom or my computer decided to restart, and I couldn't figure out how to fix it. And I was running all over the school trying to find a computer that worked. And she had to leave the class alone for 20 minutes. I forgot that happened. But she put it in her letter, and I was like, "Oh, that's right, that did
Yeah.
happen." So it was something that was important to include in the letter. I had forgotten it, so in her drafting it, that helped. But then, of course, I sprinkled my magic on it so that it was a nice, well-rounded letter. But it helped that she drafted it.
I know like the funding schemes are quite different depending on the program, but in general, what would you say are the main types of funding PhD programs in the US in general? One of the issues that a lot of applicants, struggle with is the element of rejection. I know, so for example, in the MPH class or at the master's level, the programs tend to admit a lot of students, but for a PhD, it's a limited slots. Um, so there tend to be a lot more rejections at the PhD level. What advice would you give to those who apply and get rejections, or how can they receive rejections? Well,
Well, I think in our field, rejection is just a part of it. But I just asked them to let me in on a probationary period to prove that
you
I
can, yeah.
could do it. Yeah, and I did do it. I graduated at the top of my class, got to carry the flag in at graduation. So
Hmm.
you can't let rejection stop you. If there's the opportunity to try to learn something, you should. I always suggest when students don't get in to ask, well, what can I do better when I try this again next year?